Imagine, if you will, a massive stadium-sized leaderboard.
Oh, like the kind of towering digital display you might see at the Olympic
Yeah,
Games.
exactly like that. But instead of individual athletes up there, this board lists every single nation on Earth,
Mm.
and they are ranked by success.
Right, but this is the traditional old school kind of success we're talking about, right?
Spot on. We are talking about raw wealth, sheer life expectancy, and basic educational attainment. The heavy hitters, the usual suspects of the industrialized Western world, they are exactly where you expect them to be.
Dominating the top tier, just glowing in the number 1, 2, and 3 spots.
Exactly. But then I want you to imagine you step up to the master control panel of this massive stadium and you flip a heavy switch.
Okay, I'm visualizing it. What does the switch do?
This switch adjusts the entire algorithm of the board to factor in a totally new variable. It measures the cleanliness of their growth.
The environmental cost.
Yes, the exact toll they are extracting from the planet to achieve and maintain all that wealth. You flip it, and absolute chaos ensues on the board.
I can imagine. Those highly developed nations usually take a massive hit when you factor that in.
They do. Many of those incredibly wealthy, dominant nations suddenly plummet down the rankings. They are basically in free fall, penalized heavily for the massive ecological disruption hiding behind their glowing GDP figures.
Right, the hidden cost of all that industry.
But amidst that downward cascade, one country, a nation that is very often overlooked in standard global economic roundups, suddenly shoots up the board.
Wait, they actually go up?
Oh, they fly up. It jumps past its peers by a massive 16 spots, rocketing from rank 55 all the way up to rank 39. And it does this with a giant green arrow next to its name. That country is Romania.
I mean, it is a stunning visual to start with. And I think it perfectly encapsulates the massive shift in how we are finally beginning to understand and measure global development.
Because we usually just look at the money. Right.
Exactly. For the better part of a century, we have been so profoundly conditioned to look at raw economic output that we completely forget to check the exhaust pipe.
We look at the engine, but not the emissions. I like that.
Right. When you apply what the United Nations calls the Planetary Pressures Adjusted Human Development Index, which we will just call the PHDI today, the entire global hierarchy shifts. It shifts in ways that challenge our fundamental assumptions.
So when that switch is flipped, Romania becomes this incredibly fascinating anomaly.
They really do. We are looking at a country that has managed to achieve and maintain an upper middle income, highly developed status, but with a planetary pressure footprint that sits comfortably below the world average.
And that is a very, very rare club to be in.
It really is.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because for you, the listener, whether you are running a business, managing a team, or just trying to be an informed citizen of the world, traditional metrics like the Standard Human Development Index might actually be hiding the truth.
Hiding what real, sustainable progress looks like in the 21st century.
Exactly. So the mission of this deep dive today is to act as a shortcut for you. We have pulled together a massive stack of demographic, economic, and environmental data on Romania.
And this data spans over 30 years of history, right?
Yep, over 3 decades. And we are going to extract the core insights from all these sources. We want to understand how a country manages this specific magic trick.
How they balance on this razor-thin tightrope of generating high income while actually lowering their planetary pressure.
Right, because if we can figure out the mechanisms of how they are doing it, it completely forces you to rethink how we measure global success, and maybe even how you measure success in your own life.
Exactly. And to be clear, right from the jump, we aren't just going to rattle off what the data says. We're going to look closely at the why and the how.
Because the baseline assumptions are usually pretty grim, aren't they?
They are. We need to understand why this specific case study challenges our deep-seated, almost dogmatic assumptions about modern development.
Which is usually that you have to destroy the environment to get rich.
Right. The traditional industrial narrative tells us a very simple, very brutal story. To get rich, you must pollute. To elevate your citizens out of poverty, you must consume ravenously.
You burn coal, you clear land, you extract resources.
Exactly. But Romania's trajectory over the last 3 decades offers a very compelling, albeit complex, counter-narrative to that dogma.
But to truly appreciate the nuance of that 16-spot jump in the environmental rankings, we cannot just start at the finish line.
No, we have to understand the baseline. We have to look at the foundational economic engine they built first.
Right, before we can understand how they made it run so cleanly, You cannot appreciate the environmental magic trick without understanding the sheer scale of the economic engine that got them into the highly developed category in the first place.
So let's talk about the 30-year climb.
Yeah, let's look at the Standard Human Development Index, and for those who might need a quick refresher, the HDI is essentially a composite score created by the UN.
Right, it combines three things: life expectancy, education, and standard of living.
Exactly. And Romania's trajectory on this index is genuinely staggering. We are looking at data starting in 1990.
Which is right out of the fall of communism, a period of massive upheaval.
Huge upheaval. So in 1990, their HDI score was 0.719. But by the time we hit the 2023 data, it has climbed to 0.845.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that jump from 0.719 to 0.845 represents a growth rate of roughly 17.5% over 33 years.
Which sounds like a lot, but numbers in a vacuum can be tricky. Let's put that in a global perspective.
Well, during that exact same 33-year window, the global average HDI went from 0.60 to 0.756.
Oh, wow. So Romania didn't just grow alongside the rest of the world?
No, they vastly outperformed the global average pace of development. They accelerated away from the mean.
And because of that 17.5% climb, they now sit firmly in what the United Nations categorizes as the very high human development tier.
And a huge, incredibly vital driver of that index score is purchasing power, the actual, tangible economic reality of the citizens walking down the street.
The purchasing power explosion in this source material is just wild to look at. Let's break down the gross national income, or GNI, per capita.
And importantly, the data is using 2021 purchasing power parity dollars, or PPP.
I always think it's worth pausing on PPP for a second. We aren't just doing a raw currency conversion here, right?
No, not at all. PPP accounts for the actual cost of living. It looks at a basket of goods, bread, rent, fuel.
And it asks, what kind of lifestyle does this money actually buy you in that specific country?
Exactly. And when you look at it through that lens, in 2023, Romania's GNI per capita sits at an incredibly robust $39,374.
Nearly 40 grand. And what is the world average for comparison?
The world average is just $20,327.
That is wild. Romania is generating nearly double the wealth per person compared to the global baseline.
And the historical context of the transition economy is what makes that $39,000 figure truly remarkable. You have to go back to that 1990 baseline.
Okay, what was the gap back then?
Back then, the wealth gap between Romania and the global average was relatively narrow. It was only about a $5,000 advantage for Romania.
Oh, so they weren't that far ahead of the pack to begin with.
Right. They were sitting at roughly $16,400 per capita, while the global average was lagging slightly behind. But by 2023, that advantage didn't just maintain its distance.
It completely ballooned, didn't it?
It did. That gap grew from $5,000 to roughly $19,000.
And man, this isn't just a story of incremental growth. This signals a wildly successful, multi-decade economic transition.
A transition from a heavily centralized, planned economy to a highly dynamic, globally integrated market economy.
They didn't just join the modern European economic sphere, they accelerated within it. It makes me think about how we usually describe economic growth.
How so?
Well, we usually use running analogies, right? Like a marathon runner who started in the middle of the pack and just kept a steady pace.
That's right.
But looking at these mechanisms, that analogy doesn't really work here. This isn't a foot race.
What is that then?
It's more like they were sailing a massive, clunky iron cargo ship from the 1970s. And while they were actively crossing the ocean in rough seas, they somehow managed to completely rip out the old, inefficient boiler.
And install a modern nuclear reactor, all without the ship sinking.
Exactly. And now they are cruising past the rest of the fleet. It's an incredible structural feat.
That is a much more accurate metaphor because it highlights the mechanical danger of the transition.
Because it is dangerous, right? A lot of countries fail at this.
Absolutely. Moving from a state-planned economy to an EU-integrated market economy is fraught with peril. Many nations attempt that engine swap and end up economically stranded or captured by corruption.
But Romania pulled it off.
They did. However, as with any macro-level economic data, we have to be incredibly careful not to be blinded by the top-line numbers.
Right, because high average wealth, that $39,000 figure, can very easily mask deep systemic societal flaws.
Exactly. It's just an average after all.
And that is exactly where my skepticism kicks in. Because let's be entirely honest with ourselves, we have seen this movie before.
Time and time again.
Usually, when a transitioning country's wealth explodes this fast, when a nation goes from a post-communist state to nearly 40 grand a year per capita, that wealth is ruthlessly hoarded.
It gets concentrated at the very top.
Exactly. You get oligarchs, you get massive urban versus rural divides, you get gleaming capital cities surrounded by neglected
A
provinces.
tiny fraction of the population reaps the benefits of the new market, while the rest stagnate.
So I have to push back here. Does this rising tide in Romania actually lift all boats? What happens when we look past the averages?
What's fascinating here is that the data provides a very clear, mathematically rigorous answer to that exact skepticism.
And what is the answer?
The answer is yes. To a highly surprising degree, the wealth and the development are shared.
Really? How do we actually prove that, though?
Well, to prove this, we cannot use the standard HDI. We have to use a much more sophisticated tool called the Inequality-Adjusted Human Development Index, or the IHDI.
Oh, I love the IHDI. I always think of it as basically a lie detector test for national statistics.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, you cannot hide behind a dozen billionaires when the IHDI comes to town. But walk us through how this actually works mechanically. How does it adjust the score?
It's a brilliant mathematical philosophy. The IHDI acts like a penalty system. It takes that beautiful top-line HDI score we just talked about, and it discounts it
Discounts it based on what?
based on how unevenly health, education, and income are distributed across the population.
Okay, give me an example of how that looks in practice.
Think of it this way. Imagine a country has 100 points of total wealth. If one person holds 99 points and the other 99 people share one single point, a traditional average would look at the total, divide by 100, and say, great, everyone averages 1 point.
Which completely ignores the reality on the ground.
Exactly. The IHDI acts as an alarm bell for that scenario. It penalizes the score based on the severity of the gap between the top and the bottom.
So it essentially measures the human potential that is lost to systemic unfairness.
Precisely. And globally, when you apply this inequality adjustment, the world average HDI suffers a devastating loss.
How bad is the global penalty?
The global score drops by an average of 22.0%.
That is a tragedy when you really think about it. It means nearly a quarter of human development potential globally is entirely lost to systemic inequality.
It's a huge loss.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at Romania's data,
Mm-hmm.
their HDI only drops by 10.3%.
Wow. Okay, so their inequality penalty is less than half of the global average penalty.
Yes. And this is the crucial mechanism of their success. This means Romania isn't just generating raw wealth and development. It is distributing it with remarkable fairness compared to the rest of the world.
So the rising tide really is lifting most of the boats.
Exactly. The fundamental scaffolding of their society, their public schools, their healthcare access, their baseline income floors, is holding the broader population up relatively evenly.
They avoided the extreme oligarchic capture that plagued other transitioning nations.
They really did. And this equity isn't just an economic class issue. It translates powerfully into gender parity as well.
Which is often the ultimate test of a society's structural fairness, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
And the gender metrics in this source material are absolutely wild. Let's look at the Gender Development Index, the GDI.
Right, let's break that down for the listener.
So the GDI measures the exact same things as the HDI health, knowledge, living standards, but it explicitly measures the gap between men and women.
And the scoring is a bit different here. A score of 1.0 means perfect, absolute, mathematical equality between the genders.
Right, so the global average is 0.955, but Romania scores a 0.986.
They easily beat the global average. That score lands them in what the UN designates as Group 1.
And Group 1 is an exclusive, highly desirable club to be in, right?
It really is. It means that within Romania, women and men have nearly identical Human Development Index achievements.
So the structural, historical barriers that typically prevent women from accessing education or achieving basic health outcomes are fundamentally minimized here.
Minimized to a degree we rarely see globally. We can see this even more clearly when we cross-reference it with the Gender Inequality Index, or GII.
How is the GII different from the GDI?
Well, while the GDI looks at achievements, the GII looks at the negative side. It looks at reproductive health, empowerment, and the labor market.
Right, and for the GII, a lower score is better because it measures the literal loss of achievement due to gender inequality.
Exactly. It's a measure of risk and structural disadvantage.
So the global average score for the GII is 0.455, but Romania scores a remarkably low 0.227.
Which ranks them 61st in the world.
which means the risk environment for women, the structural inequality they face on a daily basis, is literally half the global average.
It represents an incredibly low-risk social environment. But to truly understand how they built this environment, we can't just look at the composite indices.
We have to drill down into the foundational pillars that support this equality.
Exactly, specifically education and health.
Let's start with education, because the stats here are the bedrock of everything else. In Romania, women have 14.6 expected years of schooling.
That absolutely crushes the global female average.
It really does. The global average sits at just 13.08 years. And what's more important than just beating the global average is that inside Romania, there is virtually no gap between the expected schooling years of young women and young men.
If you are born in Romania, regardless of your gender, the educational infrastructure is entirely egalitarian in its outcomes.
And that equal access to over 14 years of education compounds exponentially over a lifetime, doesn't it?
Oh, massively. It leads to better health literacy, it leads to better economic opportunities, it leads to delayed and safer childbirth.
And fundamentally, it leads to better survival rates.
Which brings us perfectly to the health data, specifically life expectancy. This is where the numbers tell a story of immense triumph, but also reveal a very interesting societal divergence.
Let's hear the overall numbers first.
In 2023, Romania's overall life expectancy reached a historic high of 75.9 years.
That's a solid number. Didn't they take a hit during the pandemic, though?
They did. They completely recovered from a very sharp, tragic dip during the 2020 and 2021 pandemic years, bouncing back to their highest levels ever.
So the overall number is great, but the gender breakdown here is stark.
Stark might be an understatement, honestly.
Yeah. Romanian women have a life expectancy of 79.6 years. They're pushing 80 years old on average.
And the men.
Meanwhile, Romanian men are sitting at 72.4 years. That is a massive, gaping divergence.
Over 7 years.
Yeah. Women in Romania are outliving men by over 7 full years. What is happening there? Why the massive gap if the society is structurally equal?
It is a significant gap, and it highlights a crucial nuance in how we interpret data. Structural equality and opportunity, meaning both boys and girls get 14 years of schooling and access to the same clinics, does not automatically equal identical life outcomes.
Okay, so what's driving the 7-year difference?
It's largely driven by lifestyle factors and occupational realities.
Yeah.
In many industrialized or post-industrial societies, men are still vastly overrepresented in hazardous occupations.
You mean like heavy construction, mining, industrial transport?
Exactly. Those take a physical toll. Furthermore, behavioral factors play a huge role. Across Eastern Europe, historical data shows higher rates of smoking and alcohol consumption among men.
And I imagine they are also less likely to go to the doctor, right?
Yes, there's a well-documented reluctance among men to seek preventative health care compared to women. So the system is equitable, but the choices and occupational hazards within that system still create massive disparities in outcomes.
That makes a lot of sense.
However, when we look specifically at interventions targeted at women's health, the progress is undeniable. And I think the most striking data point in this entire deep dive has to be maternal health.
I have the numbers right here, and honestly, as someone who reads a lot of demographic data, it's rare to see a curve this steep.
We are looking at the maternal mortality ratio.
Right, and for those unfamiliar, this measures the number of mothers who die per 100,000 live births. It is one of the most raw, unflinching indicators of a functioning healthcare system.
It truly is.
So in 1990, Romania's rate was 126.9. Fast forward to 2023, and that number has plummeted to just 10.1.
That is a 92% drop. Let me repeat that. A 92% reduction in maternal death.
Wow.
It is a monumental societal triumph. To give you the global context, the world average dropped from 365 down to 216 in that same 30-year period.
So the world roughly cut it in half, which is good, but Romania practically eradicated it.
Going from over 126 deaths to just 10 is the hallmark of a highly developed, robust, and universally accessible public health system.
But I need you to explain how this happens. You don't just drop maternal mortality by 92% by accident.
No, you certainly don't.
Or just by throwing GDP at the problem. What are the actual mechanisms on the ground? Did they just build a bunch of new hospitals?
It is a combination of massive systemic overhauls driven by their transition and subsequent integration into the European Union. First, you have the historical context.
Right, the 1990 baseline again.
Yes. In 1990, Romania was emerging from a regime that had implemented draconian, highly restrictive reproductive policies for decades.
Which artificially inflated mortality rates, I assume.
Exactly, through unsafe practices and overwhelmed, under-resourced clinics. The transition to democracy immediately opened up access to modern reproductive health care, family planning, and safe practices.
So just removing the restrictive state control immediately improved the baseline.
Exactly. But then comes the structural rebuild. In the lead up to their EU accession in 2007, Romania had to adopt massive swaths of European healthcare standards.
What does that look like in practice?
We are talking about the standardization of prenatal care across rural and urban divides. It meant an influx of medical technology.
Like modern ultrasound machines and better neonatal intensive care units.
Yes, and the modernization of emergency response protocols. When a country's GNI per capita jumps from $16,000 to nearly $40,000, and it is distributed relatively evenly, as we saw with the IHDI, it changes everything.
It means rural clinics actually get funding.
Right. They get paved roads, they get reliable electricity, they get trained midwives and doctors who have access to EU standard medical training. A 92% drop is the result of thousands of moving infrastructural parts perfectly aligning.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. Think about your own country's stats for a second, wherever you are listening from.
Think about the news you read every day.
Yeah. Achieving high-income, near-perfect educational gender parity and an incredibly equitable distribution of life-saving health outcomes is incredibly rare. We are painting a picture of a nation that is wealthy, highly educated, and fundamentally fair.
It sounds almost utopian when you list it out like that.
Exactly. So if they are producing all this wealth and building all these hospitals and running all these schools and paving all these roads, what's the catch?
Because there is always a catch.
Because history tells us that heavy industry and rapid wealth generation usually require a massive, dirty energy grid. How are they doing all of this without triggering the environmental tripwire that usually accompanies this level of success?
And that perfectly brings us back to the mystery from our introduction, the green advantage.
Right, the 16-spot jump.
Exactly. How does a developed, wealthy nation avoid the ecological sins of its peers? Because normally, when a country hits a GNI of nearly $40,000 per capita, their carbon footprint goes through the roof.
Because they are building, consuming, driving, flying, and powering a very high standard of living.
It takes a lot of juice to run a modern European lifestyle.
Which takes us right back to that magic metric we opened with the planetary pressures adjusted HDI, or the PHDI.
This is where Romania leaps 16 spots up the global leaderboard.
Now, the world average PHDI is 0.60, Romania's score is a 10.739. But break down the math for us. How exactly does the UN calculate this environmental penalty?
Let's explain the mechanic of this index clearly, because it is brilliant. The UN takes a country's standard, beautiful HDI score, and they multiply it by an adjustment factor.
What goes into that adjustment factor?
It is based on two specific planetary boundaries: carbon dioxide emissions per capita and material footprint per capita.
Okay, so if a country is highly developed, but absolutely destroying the planet to achieve it, what happens?
The multiplier acts like an anchor, and their score is slashed. Heavily industrialized, wealthy nations, think of major oil exporters or massive manufacturing hubs, usually plummet in these rankings.
Because they take a massive penalty, since their wealth is entirely subsidized by ecological debt.
Precisely. Romania, however, takes a relatively tiny penalty. That remarkably small deduction is what allows them to leapfrog 16 other countries that have higher traditional wealth but terrible environmental records.
So let's look at the actual carbon miracle happening here. Romania's per capita CO2 emissions sit at just 3.43 tons.
And let's remind the listener of the global average.
The world average, and keep in mind this includes dozens of developing nations with very little heavy industry or car ownership, is 4.54 tons.
If you are listening to this in North America or parts of Western Europe, your per capita carbon footprint might be double or triple that world average.
Yet Romania, a country richer than the global average, far more developed, emits significantly less carbon per person.
They are living a modern, 21st century European lifestyle on a carbon budget that is smaller than many developing nations.
And this isn't just a fluke, is it? Like a single mild winter where they didn't run the heaters as much, or a temporary economic slowdown.
Not at all. If we look at the historical trend in the data, it reveals a profound structural transformation. Let's go back to our 1990 baseline again.
Okay, where were their carbon emissions at in 1990?
In 1990, Romania's carbon emissions were at 7.73 tons per capita. They were a heavy, inefficient, highly industrialized state running on old technology.
So they were way above the world average back then.
Yes. But over the next 3 decades, while their wealth doubled and their life expectancy soared, they more than halved their carbon intensity.
They halved it.
Yes. dropping from 7.73 down to 3.43 tons.
Wait, dropping from 7.7 to 3.4 tons of carbon isn't just a rounding error. That's an industrial revolution in reverse, or maybe an evolution.
It's definitely an evolution.
How did they actually do that? You don't have a country's emissions by just asking people to turn off their porch lights. Walk me through the physical changes on the ground.
It comes down to a concept in economics known as absolute decoupling.
Absolute decoupling. Okay, explain that.
Historically, economies achieved relative decoupling, where emissions still grew, but slower than GDP. Romania achieved absolute decoupling. GDP went up, emissions actually went down.
That sounds like magic. What is the mechanism for this?
It is multifaceted. First, the painful part of the transition. The collapse and closure of highly polluting, massively inefficient state-owned heavy industries from the Soviet era.
Oh, so the 1990s saw a lot of dirty steel mills and coal-reliant factories shut down.
Exactly. But they didn't just stay deindustrialized. As they integrated into the EU, they shifted towards a service-based and knowledge-based economy.
Tech hubs?
Yes, cities like Cluj-Napoca and Bucharest became massive IT and tech hubs. An IT firm generates immense GDP with a fraction of the carbon footprint of a steel mill.
Right. Coding doesn't require a smokestack.
Exactly.
No.
Furthermore, they modernized their energy grid, investing heavily in hydro and nuclear power, alongside a growing renewable sector, all mandated and subsidized by EU environmental targets.
So they're producing more wealth, writing more code, running more modern hospitals while burning less carbon. It really is the holy grail of economics.
What's fascinating here is that Romania serves as a living, breathing counterargument to the old industrial assumption that we talked about earlier.
That you have to pollute to get rich.
Yes. They have definitively proven that an economy can transition, it can massively grow its GDP, it can vastly improve the lifespans and education of its citizens, and simultaneously shrink its carbon exhaust pipe.
It is a testament to the power of grid modernization, increased industrial efficiency, and the strategic shift toward a service-based economy.
It really is an incredible success story.
Okay, I have to say, I'm sitting here looking at these indices, and I'm ready to crown Romania the undisputed champion of sustainable, equitable development. I'm practically ready to buy a one-way ticket to Bucharest.
I don't blame you. The numbers are fantastic.
But we have a job to do. We promised the listener we would look at all the sources, and when we turn the page in this massive stack of data, we start to see some cracks in the facade.
We do. We have to maintain our analytical objectivity.
A carbon footprint, as amazing as it is to shrink it, is only one way we leave a mark on the Earth. And when we look at the other metrics, Romania is facing some serious hidden challenges.
The PHDI, as we discussed, doesn't just look at carbon. It also looks at material footprint. And this is where the warning lights start violently flashing on the dashboard.
Yeah, the material footprint data is a massive red flag. Let's define it first. Material footprint isn't about emissions in the air, right?
No, it is the total amount of raw physical materials extracted from the earth to meet a country's final consumption demands.
So it's the biomass from farming, the fossil fuels extracted, the metal ores mined, the non-metallic minerals like sand and gravel used to pour concrete.
Exactly, all the physical stuff.
Yeah. And Romania consumes 18.6 tons of physical resources per capita. The world average is only 12.7 tons.
This is a crucial, vital distinction to make when we talk about sustainability.
Why does this 18.6 tons matter so much if their carbon is low?
Because while Romania has successfully decoupled carbon from economic growth through cleaner energy grids and phasing out old, dirty factories, they have not decoupled physical resource extraction from their lifestyle.
They are still consuming vast, heavy amounts of physical stuff to build and maintain that $39,000 GNI per capita.
They are pouring concrete for new highways, importing lithium for batteries, consuming immense agricultural biomass.
This is the hidden ecological cost of their modern lifestyle, and it represents a massive hurdle for their future sustainability. You cannot endlessly extract from a finite planet.
That's the reality of it.
It's like switching your daily drink to a diet soda, but still eating 3 whole large pizzas for dinner every night.
That is an incredibly apt analogy.
Yeah, yes, you miraculously solved the sugar problem, you addressed the carbon emissions, but the sheer physical volume of consumption, the material footprint, is still absolutely going to catch up with you.
You can't just keep extracting 18.6 tons of earth per person indefinitely and call it green.
Exactly. They have solved the emissions problem, but they have not solved the extraction problem. The physical weight of their economy is still too heavy.
And just as there is a hidden environmental cost in the material footprint, the data also reveals a hidden social disconnect.
Right. Let's pivot back to the social side.
We need to look at the Gender Inequality Index again, because there are significant shortfalls hiding beneath the surface.
Earlier, we praised their educational parity. We lauded the fact that women are getting 14.6 years of schooling.
But education and health are supposed to be stepping stones. They're supposed to translate into power, influence, and economic independence.
Right. You get the advanced degree, you live a long, healthy life, pushing 80 years old, you should be running the place. You should be in charge.
But that's not what the political data shows at all. Despite near-perfect educational equality, women hold only 18.9% of parliamentary seats in Romania.
That is a glaring, massive disconnect. They are trailing badly behind the global average of 26.5% for female parliamentary representation.
And they are vastly disproportionately behind Romanian men, who hold a commanding 81.1% of the seats.
So you have a highly educated, highly capable female populace that is systematically underrepresented in the literal rooms where the laws, the budgets, and the policies are made.
The education isn't translating into political capital.
And it bleeds directly into the workforce data, too. The female labor force participation rate in Romania has slid down to just 41.9%.
Which is really concerning.
What's really crazy to me is that if you look back at the historical data, in the year 2000, female labor participation was over 54%.
So it hasn't just stagnated, it has been actively shrinking over the last 2 decades.
Yeah. Today, it lags well behind the global average of 48.5%, and it's miles behind Romanian men, whose labor force participation rate is nearly 62%.
This raises an important question, perhaps the single most important social and economic question for Romania moving forward.
Which is?
How can a country have incredibly highly educated women who live to nearly 80 years old but see them actively shrinking from the labor force and excluded from the political spheres?
It feels like a complete paradox. All the inputs are right, the schools, the hospitals, but the output in the workforce is dropping. How do you interpret that mechanism? What is physically happening to these women?
To understand this, you have to consider the complex, sometimes painful nuances of transitioning economies and open borders.
Okay, what's the first factor?
One massive, undeniable factor is the risk of brain drain.
Brain drain.
In 2007, Romania joined the European Union. A foundational pillar of the EU is the freedom of movement.
So suddenly, a highly educated, ambitious young Romanian woman with a degree in engineering or medicine can seamlessly pack her bags.
And move to London, Paris, or Berlin, where the salaries are triple what they are in Bucharest.
Oh, I see. If the most driven, highly qualified women and men, to be fair, are emigrating to Western Europe in large numbers to maximize their earning potential, the upper labor and political statistics back home will inevitably hollow out and drop.
Exactly. You are exporting your top-tier talent.
Wow. Okay, so the very education system that makes them so highly developed also makes them highly mobile. They get the degree and they take it across the border.
It is a double-edged sword of EU integration.
But what about the ones who stay?
Secondly, for the women who stay, we have to look at the stubborn, deep-rooted persistence of traditional family structures.
So even with the advanced degrees, the societal expectation is still pulling them out of the office and forcing them into the home.
Precisely. A world-class public education system doesn't automatically erase centuries of cultural norms regarding child-rearing, domestic labor, and elder care.
In many transitioning societies, the state might proudly provide the hospital to be born in and the school to be educated in, but the culture still firmly dictates that the woman manages the household.
Therefore, despite their immense qualifications, structural family burdens often exacerbated by a lack of flexible working hours or affordable childcare keep them out of the formal, full-time workforce.
And certainly out of the demanding 80-hour-a-week requirements of political campaigning.
Exactly.
It's a sobering reality check. It really shows that societal equality isn't just a simple checklist where you tick off built a school and built a hospital and assume you're done.
No, it is a constant evolving friction between policy, economics, and deep-seated culture.
And that friction is exactly what defines the modern development challenge. It is never a straight, unbroken line upward.
Never.
So we have covered a massive amount of ground here today, and I want to make sure we synthesize this for everyone listening.
Yeah, let's tie it all together.
Let's paint a mental picture to tie all of these disparate data points together. I want you to imagine a large triangle. The 3 points of this triangle are economic growth, social equity, and environmental impact.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Now, almost every country on Earth is actively pulling that triangle completely out of shape. They chase massive economic growth, but they utterly destroy their environment. Or they mandate strict social equity, but their economic growth stagnates and everyone remains poor.
But Romania, despite the very valid, serious critiques regarding their heavy material footprint and their undeniable political gender gap,
Yeah.
manages to balance this triangle far better than most developing or even highly developed nations.
They really do. They are acting as a real-world, highly flawed, but highly functional model of a low-carbon, equitable, and economically robust society.
They prove mathematically that you can raise a population's income by tens of thousands of dollars without blowing up the atmosphere.
And you can distribute that health and education wealth fairly across the gender divide without succumbing to extreme oligarchy.
It's a powerful model.
So, what does this all mean for us, for the people not running a nation state?
It means that the future of human development, at every scale, cannot be about blind, total volume growth.
The 20th century macroeconomic mindset was just more GDP, more stuff at all costs.
Right, but the Romanian data shows us that the 21st century has to be about the cleanliness of that growth.
Mhm.
It has to be about the harmonious coexistence of environmental limits and social fairness.
You cannot simply look at a nation's bank account anymore. You have to look at its carbon ledger and its inequality index to know if it is truly succeeding.
Absolutely.
You know, you've seen today how Romania hides a heavy material footprint behind a stellar carbon record, and how world-class female education doesn't automatically equal political power.
It really makes you think.
It makes you wonder, if we stepped away from macroeconomics for a second and we applied these kinds of hidden metrics to your own life, your own community, or your own industry, what unseen costs or hidden successes would suddenly rise to the surface?
That's a great question.
If you tracked your own planetary pressure or your own inequality adjustments at your company, what would the data actually say? Is your own personal or professional growth actually clean, or are you just staring at the traditional leaderboard, measuring the exact wrong things?
That is the ultimate necessary question we have to ask ourselves when we look at complex data like this. The numbers on the spreadsheet are just a mirror.
It's entirely up to us to decide if we like what is reflected back and if we are brave enough to change the algorithm.
Keep questioning the numbers, look for the hidden costs in your own life, and until our next deep dive, stay curious.